Thank you so much for coming to the museum on this beautiful day. I really appreciate it. I was telling Betsy when I came in today to get set up, I didn't realize that I think it's always been a dream of mine to talk in an oil painting gallery in a museum, but I didn't know it until about 30 minutes ago. So I came in and I thought, I've always wanted to do this, but I didn't know. So thank you for coming and experiencing this moment with me. Can you hear me okay if I talk at this level? Okay. So I decided to talk about this little piece by Adeline Radon called Oannes et la Sphinx. And I've always liked this piece. I've always been a fan of Adeline Radon's work. And I think I've always liked his work because it's murky. There's something kind of sweet and sad about it while also being dark. There's some really lovely qualities to his work, and this piece always kind of stood out to me as one of my favorites in the collection. The other reason that I was drawn to it is it has a sphinx in it right here. And in my own research, I've been really interested in ancient Egypt and why ancient Egypt keeps being referenced in pop culture, and why people are generally interested in these ancient cultures. So that was kind of why I first was drawn to it, but I'll talk a little bit more about that throughout the presentation. So I'm going to start by talking about Redon a little bit, and then I'm going to talk about my work a little bit and where I see them intersecting. So also, one of the things that I liked about this piece was that, to me, I think of it as kind of a muddy little gem. It's got these really gem-like colors. It's kind of a muddy painting, but there's something iridescent about it. The more time I've spent with this painting and researching this painting, I think of it kind of like a walnut. You know, it's small, but there's so much packed in. For example, I started researching who this menacing butterfly figure is, and there's just so much packed into this little piece. It's pretty amazing. So I'm going to start off with a little bit about Adeline Radon. Adeline Radon was born in 1840 in Bordeaux, France. His family was wealthy, and he spent his youth drawing and painting. In an effort to please his family, he studied to be an architect. However, he failed his final exams. After failing to move forward as an architect, he spent the rest of his 20s dabbling in the arts, particularly engraving, lithography, and sculpture. In 1870, he was drafted into the army and fought in the Franco-Prussian War, and he was 30 years old at this time. And I think these old war photos are pretty amazing. These are the French soldiers, and these are the Prussian soldiers with these amazing hats. And then this is a piece by an illustrator named Cossack from 1871, illustrating the Franco-Prussian War. Serving in the army and seeing battle was a catalyst for Redon. After the war, he moved to Paris and focused completely on his artwork. However, he struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder, which manifested in dark visions and depression. And I love this quote by him that he says, "I have a feeling only for shadows." It's so dark. Most of his drawings at this time were only done in black, and they were mostly charcoal drawings. He did some engravings, some lithography, and they featured really dark subject matters like winged devils gripping giant faces with empty eye sockets, monsters hanging in empty space, ears sprouting bat wings, and faces emerging from the backs of spiders. It's also interesting to note that just 2 decades earlier, Charles Darwin had published The Origin of the Species, and the haunting concept of mutated life gripped Europe. Redon's charcoal drawings illustrated our murky and prehistoric biology. But Redon's interest in science slowly grew to include the spiritual. He combined the German idea of natural philosophy, the theory that all things living are interconnected, with elements from Buddhist and Hindu philosophy. This newfound interest helped him heal, and this was reflected by the emergence of color in his work and the shift in the mood. So even this painting of the Cyclops is the Cyclops is kind of sweet. Everything feels a lot less foreboding than it was in the beginning. And then by the 1890s, Redon moved almost exclusively to colored pastel, saying that it comforted him. So you see this big shift in his work. It's butterflies. Redon's artwork is closely allied with the Symbolist art movement. Symbolism initially developed as a French literary movement in the 1880s. Reacting against the rationalism and materialism that had come to dominate Western European culture, symbolists proclaimed the validity of pure subjectivity and the expression of an idea over a realistic description of the natural world. This philosophy, which would incorporate the poet Stéphane Mallarmé's conviction that reality would be best expressed through poetry because it paralleled nature rather than replicating it, became a central tenet of the movement. In Mallarmé's word, to name an object is to suppress 3/4 of the enjoyment to be found in the poem. Suggestion, that is the dream. And I think other than this painting, this might be my new favorite painting too. I love this one, with a little shell.
What's the name of that?
You know what? I think it's The Birth of Venus. Though it began as a literary concept, symbolism was soon identified with the artwork of a younger generation of painters who were similarly rejecting the conventions of naturalism. Symbolist painters believed that art should reflect an emotion or idea rather than represent the natural world in the objective, quasi-scientific manner embodied by realism and impressionism. Returning to the personal expressivity advocated by the Romantics earlier in the 19th century, they felt the symbolic value or meaning of a work of art stemmed from the recreation of emotional experience in the viewer through color, line, and composition. In painting, symbolism represents a synthesis of form and feeling, of reality and the artist's inner subjectivity. I'm almost done reading from my slides. I know it's like an art history lecture. The symbolists, like Redon, produced imaginary dream worlds populated with mysterious figures from biblical stories and Greek mythology, as well as fantastical, often monstrous creatures. Their suggestive imagery established what would become the most pervasive themes in symbolist art: love, fear, anguish, death, sexual awakening, and unrequited desire. This painting by Redon from 1911, titled Silence, is often cited as the epitome of symbolist style and intent. The figure in the painting has closed eyes. They exist in an indeterminate space, only partially emerging from the surrounding darkness. The painting contains the suggestion of a mysterious reality beyond appearances. The subject suggests concentration on what is unseen and unheard. This piece from 1890, titled Closed Eyes, has a similar theme of reserve, isolation, and deeper reality, and doesn't use specific iconography to express that idea. So in addition to being associated with the symbolists, Redon is also often associated with a growing interest in the occult at the turn of the century in Paris. In the late 1880s, occultism and mysticism were seen as tools for social commentary and change. The interest was a reaction to the societal emphasis on commercial prosperity, industrialization, and scientific progress. And it could be said that the current surge of the occult in pop culture and art is a similar response to technology and capitalism. Redon's drawings and lithographs from at least 1891 to 1894 were placed on display at Edmund Bailey's bookshop, La Librairie de l'Art Indépendant, a center for the dissemination of occult thought. Bailey's shop was a hotspot for morphine addicts, magicians, and Satanists. Yeah, I know, it's true. Truth is stranger than fiction. Redon's work sold well there. Additionally, his work was advertised and promoted in occult journals. In 1893, the mystical journal LeClair devoted an entire issue to Redon. And LeClair's director, Jules Boyce, then engaged in a public lecture series titled Occultism, Esotericism, and Magic, and in the middle of writing his major treatise, Satanism and Magic, hailed Redon as he who has contributed the most with his intense and austere art to the coming of mysticism. This piece called Serpent Halo is actually considered a satanic drawing with satanic subject matter. And it's kind of funny to look at it now because it doesn't really seem that way, but what's happening in this image is there's a pregnant woman. She's being wrapped by a serpent. The serpent is curved over her head to create a halo, which I guess is a reversal of the Virgin Mary. And then in the background, there's actually a cauldron. There's kind of a dark spot with some smoke coming up. So this piece, when Redon made it, it was actually supposed to be a satanic piece about Satanism. So right now, it just kind of looks like a lady wrapped in a serpent, but really interesting to think about the context. And I actually think it's pretty fascinating that Satan worship was so popular in Paris in the 1880s. Who knew? That's why you have to do these kind of artist reports. And then, so at this point, I'd like to come back to this little painting here, Oannes et la Sphinx, and talk about what's in this piece. The first thing that I mentioned before that drew me in was the Sphinx in general, and the Sphinx is a repeating image in Redon's work. This is another painting he did with the Sphinx titled Red Sphinx. And it jumped out to me because in my own work and research, I've been interested in the layered and appropriated symbols and stories in occult imagery, particularly the seemingly timeless and tireless interest in ancient Egypt. And the interest in ancient Egypt can be traced back to pretty much the 1400s, the 1700s, throughout medieval Europe, people were looking at traces of Egypt and thinking that the Egyptians had all sorts of secrets. So one of my favorite examples is this German Dominican friar named Albert Magnus, who is credited for writing this book, Egyptian Secrets, White and Black Art for Man and Beast. And this book was very popular in the late 1700s, 1800s, and 1900s, and you can still buy copies of it today. Actually, my favorite is, I looked it up on Amazon, and there's some really funny reviews saying, this book did not work. I'd like my money back. These spells are nothing is happening, which is kind of, it's really, I actually think it's really interesting. But the interesting thing about it is, to me, is that this friar, Albert Magnus, who lived in the 13th century, is actually credited for writing a lot of alchemical texts. And he really didn't, but he was used as a symbol to add validity to all this writing. So people said it's written by this priest from the 1200s, but he really didn't write it. So there's some really interesting stuff wrapped up in the occult imagery and all this layered appropriation from Egypt. Here's an image from a recent show from the Folk Art Museum in New York. There was a show called Mystery and Benevolence, Masonic and Odd Fellows. And here are some of the Masonic tools and regalia they had on exhibition. And my personal favorite, this video still of Katy Perry's 2014 video Dark Horse. So there's just this continuing thread of interest in the ancient Egyptians. And the really interesting thing about the ancient Egyptians is that they truly are fascinating. But it's also fascinating that we keep looking to them for secrets and answers. But actually, this menacing butterfly is even more interesting, I learned. So when I first came to the museum to try to pick out a piece to do this talk, I read this Oannes et la Sphinx, and I don't speak French, and I assumed it was French for spirit or something, so I thought, this must be the spirit of the Sphinx. But then I found out, after doing some internet research, followed up by some real book research, that Oannes is actually a Mesopotamian god who shows up in Mesopotamian mythology. He's an amphibious being who taught mankind wisdom. Oannes, as described by the Babylonian priest Berosus, had the form of a fish but the head of a man under the fish's head, and under the fish's tail the feet of a man. In the daytime he came up to the seashore of the Persian Gulf and instructed mankind in writing, so cuneiform at the time, the arts and the sciences. Oannes was probably the emissary of Ea, god of the freshwater, deep, and wisdom. So I find that fascinating, and I'm going to tell you more about it. This is some actual images of Oannes. But Oannes is also depicted in several of Redon's other pieces. So here are two of his other paintings that have Oannes in it. You can tell I get really excited about this part. But here's what gets even more interesting. So I started looking up Oannes, and I was thrilled to learn that he was a Babylonian god, and that there was all this history. But what's even more interesting is when you start researching this, there's actually groups of people who think that this is documentation of alien contact. So there's a whole, and you can really fall down some interesting rabbit holes with this, because people think that Oannes may have been an alien who came to Earth and gave all this knowledge to the Mesopotamian people. So all of a sudden, cuneiform writing comes into play. Basically, society is born after they meet this mythological figure. There's also a whole slew of people who connect the shape of Oannes' hat to what the Pope wears. So you can really get into some interesting rabbit holes, but that's not really what this presentation is about. But what I am interested in general, in my work, is that there's this human desire for the existence of the supernatural, and I'm interested in the way that this desire is translated into cultural stories and symbols. So whether that is Redon's work or weird pathways in the internet, of trying to find connectedness in the world and trying to find mystery and answers. To me, that's what I make my work about, and that's what I'm interested in. So I was thrilled to realize that this connected to alien conspiracy theories. I can't even tell you. And it looks like a little butterfly, and so I was so happy. So now I'm going to transition to talking a little bit about my own work. As an artist, I'm interested in mythology, materiality, and space. In my work, mythology, scientific history, and New Age idealism become starting points for an investigation into the creation of meaning and the formation of knowledge. In a way, my work parallels Redon's. Redon collected, presented, and abstracted global mythological symbols to present a picture of an unknown and mystical world. Through sculpture and installation, I also collaged together symbols and stories. While I assume that Redon was hoping to reflect on society, history, and present the possibility of the unknown, I am to reflect on the desire for the unknown. And I think that this quote by Eugene Thacker speaks very well to this idea. In his book, In the Dust of This Planet, Horror of Philosophy, he writes, "In occult philosophy today, the world is hidden, and in the last instance, only knowable in its hiddenness." And just a side note, this book, In the Dust of This Planet, is about the history and contemporary philosophy on the occult, science fiction, and its role in popular culture. A key element that I draw from in my work is the mythologization of natural phenomena and the transformation its transformation, such as evaporation and decay, into culture. Folklore and mythology are full of stories about transformation and explanations for natural phenomena. So one of my favorite stories where some natural occurrence is translated into a folktale is this one here. This is an illustration from a Polish story called The Snow Maiden. And in this story, there's a childless couple, and they pray and pray and pray for a child. And one day they go out and they make a little snowman, and it turns into a little girl. They all live a pretty relatively happy life until one day the little girl is out with some village children, and they're all playing this game where they hop over the fire. So they egg her on to do it, and then when she goes to jump over the fire, she immediately evaporates because she was only made out of snow. And although this might be a story about the fables of, a story about the dangers of succumbing to peer pressure, I think it's also a really interesting idea of turning natural phenomena into a story. The natural world is mythologized throughout history. Early Western scientific study combines spiritual allegory with transmutation, defining chemical reactions as chemical weddings, and illustrating science through Rosicrucian symbols and Christian allegories. And in contemporary popular culture, early myths about the supernatural are ever present. They are represented in the media, urban legends, and new waves of spirituality. My artwork explores this idea through installation meant to depict fantastical and liminal spaces, sculptures designed to suggest portals to other realms, and objects that suggest agency in other worlds.
Was that yours?
Yeah.
Okay, can you, I
yeah.
dance, but will you tell me when it's your work?
Oh yeah, so all the paintings, I'm sorry, so all the paintings that I've shown have been Redon's work.
Right.
And then all the sculptural pieces that I just showed were my work.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I should have explained that. Yeah, so these are some of my pieces. Here's a detail. So this was a large structure that you could enter into. And I like the idea of entering into a space that's an alternative space, meant to transport you somewhere. The interior of this is all made out of foam, cardboard, glass, so all man-made materials that have been transformed pretty obviously, so they're kind of sloppily made so that it becomes this man-made world turned into a little fantastical capsule. This is another piece I did where you could enter into a transformed space. This piece was made out of netting and crystals and paint, and I made a lot of netting and then also collected camouflage netting and then dipped it in paint until it started to mimic natural materials like vines.
Where did you display that?
This is in Michigan, actually. In a space in Michigan, yeah. But then this is some of my more recent work. This piece was exhibited at Bullseye Gallery, who represents me, because I actually do a lot of work with glass, cast glass, which you'll see most of it becomes cast glass here. This piece for me was actually a real pivotal piece. It's titled Portal, and it's a ring of glass mushrooms going through a life and decay cycle. And what was really interesting to me about this piece was that it suggested the potential to go to another space versus the other pieces, that big cave and the room that you walk into that show you another space, and I was hoping to show you a space. I made this shift to trying to suggest another space. So this idea that you could cross a threshold and enter into another space, but the desire for that is much more much richer than anything I could ever make. You know, I think that I'm very interested in that desire now. This was an exhibition at Bullseye Gallery, and it was titled after Michel Foucault's essay called Of Other Spaces, which explores the idea of utopias and heterotopias, so this idea of alternative realities and liminal spaces. Here's a close-up of this piece. And the idea of a mushroom ring, mushroom rings pop up in fairy tales. So in fairy tales and folklore, if witches dance with the devil or fairies dance in a circle at night, then mushrooms pop up. So again, it's making a story out of just mushroom growth patterns. And that's actually how Rip Van Winkle got swept away. He stepped into a fairy ring of mushrooms. So I was very interested in that. This is another piece that I did that I think explores the desire for alternate realities. This piece is called Divert, and it's a series of 5 cast glass clams. And inside the clams, you can see, inside the clams, there's little bits of metal plants and horsehair and crystals in there, and they're just open enough where you can just kind of see inside. So the idea is that the viewer has to project themselves inside. And to me, these pieces are a direct translation of the first piece that I showed that was that walk-in space, which I called a grotto. except that piece you could enter into, and this piece you just hope that you could enter into. And I'm also really interested in how people move their body around and interact with artwork, so I installed these so that they were a little bit low, so you actually had to kind of bend down and work a little bit and move your body in that way. I think that's one reason that I said I also like this piece, where I called it a little gem. Or a little walnut, where there's something about it where it feels like this rich little piece that you have to kind of, I don't know, that it changes your interaction with it based on scale. If it was a huge painting of Oannes and the Sphinx, it would feel completely different than feeling like you could enter into this little locket or little gem. And just to talk about my materials, I use a wide range of materials, particularly cloth, leather, hair, glass, and steel. And my material choices are governed by each material's cultural history and its ability to impart meaning. Hair, leather, and cloth reference the body, memory, and culture. And then glass, with its decorative and scientific history, represents preservation while simultaneously signifying fragility and impermanence. And then casting these forms in a translucent crystal-like material draws upon the countless fairy tales and stories that explain natural occurrences as myths. And one of my favorite stories about involving glass is this story called The Glass Mountain, and sometimes called Seven Ravens. And in this story, there's a little girl, and she has 7 brothers, and her 7 brothers are transformed into ravens, and they're all locked away in a glass mountain. And so this youngest sister, this little girl, is tasked to go rescue her brothers. And this is kind of a reoccurring, there's a couple different, I think the 7 swans, so this story repeats itself throughout fairy tales. But anyways, this is my favorite one. So she has to go rescue her brothers. They're locked in a glass mountain. The interesting thing about that is that it's very hard to even find the glass mountain because glass reflects light. So it's hard to even see it. It seems to shift. By the time she gets there, it's hard to scale because it's slippery and sharp. But she finally finds it, and on her way trying to find this mountain, she meets a wide cast of characters, and one of them gives her a special key to get into the glass mountain when she gets there. And the key just so happens to be a wishbone. So by the time she finds this shifting, reflective mountain, gets to the top, she realizes that she lost the key, and in a moment of desperation, she just relies on her own body and cuts off her finger and sticks it in at the keyhole, and it turns because it's also a bone. And then she rescues all her brothers, and everyone's saved, and they live happily ever after. But to me, this is a really phenomenal story because 1, the heroine is a little girl. 2, it involves transformation, which is something I'm just fascinated by. 3, she relies on her own body, which I think is really interesting. And just like I said, I'm interested in our spatial relationship to artwork. I'm interested in our bodily relationship to art and objects. And then also glass is a major feature, and glass is one of my favorite materials. And I'm really affected by and influenced by books. Over the last 3 years, my studio practice has become increasingly research-based. And this has been really exciting for me because it's given me the opportunity to come and research pieces like this, or meet other researchers and artists internationally and nationally. So here's some of the books that have really influenced me. If anybody's interested in Masonic temples, the early beginnings of occult in America, I highly recommend this book, Occult America, that's on the screen. It's also available on Audible, so that's always good to know. But I wanted to talk a little bit about how I began this more research-oriented practice. It all started when I began this piece titled Hall of Conversion, which consists of 74 hanging glass dishes and cast little objects. And each one of the objects transforms, so it starts as a rock, and then they go through a shape shift and a color shift. And while I was making this piece and casting all these pieces, they each weigh the exact same amount, and so I started thinking a lot about material transformation and the history of that and where that pops up in history. And so I started thinking a lot about alchemy. And And so I started, here's some more images of it. I started trying to research alchemy online, which is not a good process. Here's some more images. This is another piece that I did called Crystalline Conversion. So similar idea, everything weighs the same amount. And they go through a material, a shape shift where they start as a rock and then they'll grow into a plant or a mushroom and then melt and crystallize. So anyway, so I was researching alchemy, and I ended up again in some dark places in the internet where I couldn't figure out if I was reading Harry Potter fan fiction or World of Warcraft information, because there's a lot of crossover. You know, people have taken information about alchemy and just really run with it. So I realized I actually needed to go to a library. So I wrote a grant. I got a Regional Arts and Culture Council grant to visit the Yale University Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library and do some research on alchemy there. And it was a really amazing experience for me because here's a picture of the research center, which is pretty amazing. I got to spend some time looking at these texts from the 1200s all the way to the 1700s. And I had a whole project plan. I expected to make a whole body of work, make a book about it, do all these drawings. And when I got there, I was just struck by some confusion about what I was doing there and what I had hoped to learn. And I realized that I had this hope that I was going to sit in front of these books and somehow all this information was going to be transferred to me. And the great thing about the Beinecke Library is you can actually check out these giant magnifying glasses. So I'm sitting there with these giant magnifying glasses, looking at all these books. I don't speak Latin. I have no idea what I'm looking at. And I just realized, like, why am I here? Why did I think this was going to happen? And so I left really interested in that idea, and it's really fueled a lot of my work. So that desire for secret knowledge, that desire for transformation. And this trip has influenced pretty much all my work, but in different ways than I expected. So here's some more images. So I came back and I started making work about tools for measurement. This series is called divination rods. They're made out of glass, and they have little stainless steel holders. And so I was interested in this idea of measuring and special alchemical instruments, surveyor's tools. This is another piece I did exploring that idea of transformation. This one's called Metonic Transfiguration. And that refers to the metonic cycle, which is a cycle of 235 syndonic months, so based off of the moon. So I was thinking a lot about alchemy. This piece is called Table of Material Contents, and each piece represents another part that was in the show, and a different material. So there's glass, there's horsehair, there's silver on the table. So I was really interested in this idea of combination of materials. They're also on a pearlescent plexiglass that's meant to look, it looks magical, but it's really plastic. So I was interested in what happens when you combine all these materials. And then I'm going to wrap this up with just a few of my recent projects. This February, I was an artist in residence at Kutztown University in Pennsylvania, and I had the opportunity to go there and research their really special history of folk magic in their area. For some reason, there's actually reasons, but Pennsylvania, this particular part of Pennsylvania, is this really interesting mashup of different cultures and alchemy and folk rituals, and they have their own special processes there and rituals that are a combination of things that came over from Europe, some things that are very Americanized, and then some Native American rituals. So it's really interesting. So I spent some time talking to researchers there about that, and then mounted this large show called Long Lost. And one of the things I did was I hung all these glass pieces that are cast from objects that you might find in the area, and they're hung from these large structures that are based off of geometric symbols from the area. So if you think about Pennsylvania barns, they all have those those symbols on them. And there's actually an interesting history to those that connects to this whole folk ritual. So I started researching that, but I also picked some symbols that are pretty universal. And I like the idea that sometimes things lined up in this work, and so there were meanings when things connected, and some of it was just arbitrary. And to me, I'm really interested in that, how there's this combination in the world of intent and then just random meaning and how we search for meaning. And one of my favorite things was that the shadows from these reflected onto the floor, and they created these infinity patterns. So again, another layer of symbology and meaning. So here's some images of that. I also created an interactive website and a blog where I kept it up for the length of the show and collected research from the area and about the occult. And then I've also been working on an ongoing project in northern Scotland where I've been exploring evaporation and salt production. This is one of the sites where I was collecting salt. It's an area called Brora where they actually traditionally did collect salt in these large salt pans. But I cast my own collection pans, and I started doing this ritual of collection and evaporation. And I'm still in process with this piece, but what was interesting to me is this idea of the making of a myth and what's true and what's fiction, and just that transformation of salt water into salt. So it's kind of murky because I'm still figuring it out, but I thought I'd close with these last images. And then here's some of the evaporated salt. And then this last image called Ophelia by Redon, I'm sorry. So this was a really great exercise because it made me realize there are a lot of crossovers between his work and my work, which I wasn't really thinking about, and it helped me sort of place myself in the world of art and what I'm responding to, and different types of lineage that I didn't even know that I had, which I think is really phenomenal to happen for any artist. So in conclusion, in thinking about Redon, his use of mythology and symbols, I see common ground in how I use stories and symbols in my own work. Most importantly to me, Redon reminds us that the search for the unknown isn't unique to this time, and that throughout history, small subsets of people have mined the histories and stories in search of something beyond what they can perceive. So that is the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening. I think we have about 15 minutes if anybody has any questions, or it's a lot of reading, I know. Yeah.
You, in your own work, you mine histories and stories and mythology, but it's not overtly narrative in and of itself.
Right.
Do you explicitly or expressly avoid narrative, or is that?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess you could make narrative sculpture, but I think it's a little bit more difficult. I think it's probably more straightforward to make a narrative painting than a narrative sculpture now that I think about it. So maybe it happens a little bit by accident, but I'm not really, what's interesting, that's a great question. What's interesting to me is the idea of bringing things together and then how people respond to materials and shapes and symbols. And so I'm more interested in kind of an abstraction than a narrative, if that makes sense. Yeah.
So when people look at your work and they respond to it, is there something that a spectator or an audience member has told you once that has really struck you or stuck with you about your work in terms of any of the things that you were talking about during this presentation?
Not that I can remember off the top of my head, which, yeah, I don't know. That's a good. Yeah, I'm not.
I was just wondering if, someone who was writing some of that Harry Potter fan fiction came up and was like, man, that alchemy stuff, whoa.
Well, it's interesting about that. Yeah, I mean, the Harry Potter fan fiction thing, I would.
Use one example.
Yeah, I'd love to talk to somebody about Harry Potter fanfic. Actually, what happens to me is I use mushrooms in a lot of my work. because I'm interested in how they show up in fairy tales, how what they mean in nature. They create decay, and also I'm interested in how they're connected to psychedelic culture. And in Oregon, every show I have, people come up and tell me new mushroom facts. So that's the main thing that happens to me is people tell me about interesting mushrooms. But I think the Harry Potter fan fiction thing is really interesting, and it made me realize how important research is and how multi-layered history is and pop culture. Because I started researching this, and I didn't realize that Nicholas Flamel was a real person. And apparently he was, but for those of you who've read Harry Potter, he shows up in that story. I thought he was just something that J.K. Rowling came up with. And so it's been really interesting to just learn more and learn how important it is to research. Even that friar that I mentioned, the 13th century friar, who was just used to make something seem more valid. I mean, that's fascinating. And then when I was in Pennsylvania, looking at some of the books that people were writing and some of the images that people were using, all of that came over from Europe and was based off of what people thought Magnus was writing. So it's really interesting how multi-layered everything is, especially when you think about appropriation and what appropriation means. I mean, it's really made me think a lot about what appropriation is and just how everything is appropriated and multi-layered. So I've actually found it really fascinating. Yeah. But yeah, I just learned mushroom facts. That's what people come and tell me. It's just interesting. Great.
There,
yeah.
You mentioned Pennsylvania, and there are parts of the world and of this country that have these rich kind of mythological / occult histories in Southern California. Right?
Yeah.
Have you looked in this area here? Is that happening here? Are there cults and occult and that kind of thing happening?
Oh, I'm sure there are. What I think is really interesting about the Pacific Northwest is that so many people came here to get away from society, mainstream society. And so I think that the history of the Northwest is pretty fascinating because there are cults and sects of people who have just kind of come over to be left alone to investigate or to live their life the way they want to. I mean, I grew up in Southern California and grew up in a very New Age culture. And so that's what really spurred a lot of my interest and investigation of this to try to understand the point of view that I grew up with. But there's something really interesting about the West Coast version of things, and then there's something really fascinating about the East Coast version of things, which I've always focused on the West Coast, but going to Pennsylvania was really fascinating to kind of think about all these people coming over and immigrating from Germany and just different places in Europe at that time. So it's really interesting history there. Yeah.
Are you still involved in the project you were talking about, like the Scottish project?
Yeah. I'm actually going back in July. I'm teaching a class and a symposium, and then there's an exhibition opening there in a 300-year-old barn. And I'm going to be doing an installation along with 3 other artists, and each of us have been given our own barn to do an installation in. And so my work there is going to be much more mythology based and less of the SALT project. The SALT project kind of started as a way for me to try to connect with the landscape a little bit. And so I've been working on some work just about mythology and this idea of mythological spaces, and then this salt collection project too. So I'm looking forward to collecting more salt and resolving the project this summer. Yeah. Well, thank you guys so much for coming out.
Thank you.